Hello, welcome to the Meeting Tent, an ongoing series on the work of Stan Tenen. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our usual cast of characters, Del Packer, Daniel Gill, and Levana Tenen. Unfortunately, Michael Andron could not join us today, so we'll plow along without him. Today, we're going to continue our look at some of the articles that were written in what's called the Etorus Journal, which is available on our website, meru.org. And I'll show you how to get there. If you go to www.meru.org, this is our homepage. And what you want to do is click on Newsletter Archive. And today we're going to look at article, and you can see there's a lot of these go back, some of them go back to 1999, the early ones. But the one we're looking at today is number 57. It's right here, February 2012. So I'll click on that. And we're going to go through this. It has, it's mostly what we're going to be talking about is the inverted T. We've discussed this before several times. This gives another perspective of that. However, before we do that, I want to play a little of the video. Now, I've played this once before, and how the inverted T came about. But I'm going further back on this video because it explores how things evolved with Stan and how a lot of his research evolved. So this is on our website, meruvideo.com, and it's called A Prayer for Peace. And I'm going to just pick it up right in kind of the middle of this video.
Form follows function. It's not like an arbitrary shape for an arbitrary thought. It's a form that is directly derived from the function of the name of the letter. Big idea. And I didn't realize at first how important it was. It's now critical. That needs discussion, and people should question, well, are you sure about this? And what did you do? What did you not do? There are a lot of details. But the bottom line is, put a proposal. The scientific method says put a proposal on the table, the best one you can come up with, and then try to criticize it. Don't build it up like a salesman, take it down like a critic, until you can distill it to the basic elements that are irrefutable. What we're proposing is not in competition with the current understanding that's out there. There's thousands of people writing translations of Kabbalistic texts, and from all different perspectives, and they all have a right to their opinion. If I've done my work by using the scientific method properly, if I've done my work properly, that this is not based on an opinion. It's based on a hypothesis that has faced every form of criticism you can imagine. And these are demonstratable principles, not just beliefs. And that's what we found. That's the basis of what we're doing. The rabbis teach that we go with Hillel because in the dispute between Hillel and Shammai, Shammai only presented his argument. Hillel presented Shammai's argument before he presented his own. You give honor to the other first. You don't start off with the assumption you know everything. You start off with the assumption everyone knows something, and you take the strongest critic and start with that. And then you contrast what you find with the best example of what doesn't correspond to what you're proposing. You make the best possible argument when you do that. And it's a decent thing to do. Most of what we're talking about is based on a kind of humility, a kind of willingness to believe that this is a wonderful universe. And we're good creatures, but we're not always good and we're not perfect, and there's always more to learn. And sometimes you have to go into territory that is not comfortable. But if you're honest, you have to do it. And if you're not honest, then you don't get the best result. I spent thousands of hours just staring at shapes and reading textbooks and all kinds of theories about what's important about different things. And there are many teachings that apply to the Golden Rule. The rabbis say, they say that when Hillel was asked if he could present what he could explain what Torah is while standing on one foot, that would be desirable. So this is what Hillel said when challenged to do that. And the story may be apocryphal, but this is the story that comes down. Is that if you're asked what is the foundational principles of Torah, what is the summary of the work, he said, don't do to others what's hateful to yourself. A version of the Golden Rule. And there are many different versions. We talk about that in the book in some detail. Why is the Golden Rule so important, so central? Philosophers and scientists agree. Artists agree. The golden proportion shows up in many places. The golden proportion is an analytic representation of part of the Golden Rule. And more recently, I've realized that there's more than one Golden Rule. I was only looking at one, and that's the one on the first poster that I came up. I was thinking about what is the geometry that represents the Golden Rule. Don't do to others what's hateful to yourself, or do unto others. But that one, I couldn't get any place with that. It was too complicated. So I went to the Hermetic version, which is also in Kabbalah, as above, so below. There's a principle in heaven, in the abstract higher realm, that when you apply it, it produces a similar principle in human experience on the earth plane. As above, so below. And as I drew on the poster, the first thing I thought of was, well, the obvious thing, as above, so below, is you take an image, a simple image, and you write it above, and you write it below it. You duplicate it. So it could be a point on top of a point, or a line with a parallel line above and a parallel line below. And so there's a line above and a line below. You don't get anything from that. It's not productive. So I literally, I'm trying to remember now, it was hundreds of hours. I just ran it through my mind. How can you represent as above, so below in a more elegant and meaningful way than just a couple of parallel lines? And I ended up with the phrase, the one going upward is the same as the whole going under. That if you look up, there's a single principle, one, and there should be a corresponding principle below it that is the whole story. One above and whole below. And I ended up drawing an inverted T with a vertical line over a horizontal line. The one going up is the vertical line, reaching to God, to the transcendent, and the one below is like the earth plane. It's like represents the ground we stand on. And then it hit me. But a vertical line on top of a horizontal line in an inverted T, that vertical line is metaphorically like a foot standing on the earth. It's Torah on one foot. This is the image that corresponds to what Hillel said.
This school of Shammai and Hillel, it was an interesting little comment there in how to present an idea or an argument, and having respect for the other person's argument. Are any of you familiar with this story?
Yeah, sure. They just have almost always opposite opinions in the Talmud. In the Mishnah, there are both what are called Tanaim. Each one was a Tana, which means it literally means a teacher. But it's a special, like there's a whole history of rabbinics, and the Tanaim are the authors of the Mishnah, and so they're kind of foundational rabbis, I guess you could say, Hillel and Shammai, and they had almost always. I'm not even sure if they ever agree about anything, but they have like just opposite opinions. If this one says up, this one says down, and vice versa. The interesting thing is they were known to, even though their students argued vehemently with each other, but they were known to marry each other also, meaning, they weren't, there was no personal animosity between the two different schools of thought. So there was animosity in terms of opinion, but there wasn't, it's obviously different, but if you can imagine, like you never could imagine it today, if like a Bernie Sanders supporter would marry someone who likes Trump. Like, it just would never happen. Like, they hate each other. Whatever no political opinion, I'm saying, like, that would never happen, right? Because there's visceral hatred between those two viewpoints. Whereas with Hillel and Shammai, there was a convergence of a central idea, which also relates to what Stan's talking about here, Torah on one foot, meaning they both had a deep commitment to this one idea. And so therefore, and they both had respect for each other, and their students married, the families married into each other, and there was no problem because they had this Torah on one foot. They had this ability to recognize this foundational idea that everyone agreed upon. And so therefore you can have terribly divergent opinions, again, not to bring it into the modern world, but if you don't have Torah on one foot, if you don't have this idea of what's hateful to me, I won't do to another person, or if you don't have some sort of foundational principle that you adhere to, then divergent opinions become vastly divergent, and then becomes hatred, and God forbid, even worse. So they're known as what's called the machloket l'shem shamayim, an argument for the sake of heaven. And they both had really good intentions in mind, and more than that, they agreed upon a very foundational idea, which is that they were trying to figure out the truth, not just because they felt a certain way, but because they were using their minds to try to figure it out. And that's a completely different thing. Then you can have arguments. If one person has it worked out and they spend a lot of time figuring out their opinion, and they have ideas and they have facts, and then the other person does the same thing and it's a different opinion. So then you can have a meaningful discussion and argument, and it doesn't necessarily mean you come to agreement, but at least there's some. It's not just feeling based. It's research, and I think that's another thing to keep in mind about what that means. A machloket l'shem shamayim. It feels good to argue when you've got your own opinion. I feel so great. I've got this argument. It makes me feel good to express myself. That's wonderful, but you're still ultimately just serving yourself unless you put in the work to try to figure it out. And I think that's, of course, one of Stan's, one of the greatest things about him was his integrity and his, he's like he said, it's very important. That's an important point he makes. He sat for thousands of hours trying to figure this out. So that gives it, whether you agree or not, or are interested or not. Hopefully you are interested, but because it's interesting, that gives it a certain. Again, that's like that's the earth plane part. That's the part that you're standing on. The work, and they're like, okay, I'm sitting down and my brain hurts and I've been at this for a while and I don't know what it means, but you keep going. And then the vertical part is the feeling, is the like, wow, this is something really important and it's something very spiritual. And so again, both Hillel and Shammai definitely had both those ideas.
So this, just to put it in context, this was in Roman period, Roman times. And were these two separate schools, or was this one school? And then how did that work? Was there an argument that was put forth, and then they would, what was the mechanics of how this worked?
Yeah, this is the kind of, I think this is the Second Temple period, definitely before the destruction of the Second Temple. And so there are, the beautiful thing about the Talmud is the kind of breadth and depth of subject matters. There's just so much, it's kind of like the rabbinic movement is whatever it is now. In its inception was fundamentally anti-fundamentalist. Well, it says in the good book, and it's like, well, yeah, okay, well, let's look at the wording, let's look at the context, let's look at how we can understand this and what is it really saying. And once you start doing that, then all of a sudden it's not just as simple as what it says. There's a lot more depth. There's a lot more depth to it. I mean, it sounds even silly for me to say that, because the depth is just unbelievable. I mean, you could spend hours on one page, years on one page trying to figure stuff out, because the depth is so profound, and there's commentary upon commentary upon commentary, and it veers off through thousands of years of rabbinic teaching. And adjudication and like, rabbinic law, and like it's unbelievable the depth, and so there could be a subject like when you're checking your house for leavened material the night before Pesach, how do you do that? How far do you check? Do you check behind the books? Do you check underneath, behind the cracks? Like there's all that's an argument between Hillel and Shammai. How do you do that? And so then what happens in the Talmud is then they dissect that based on many other Tanaitic, many other kind of source materials from the same time period, and they argue in the name of Hillel. Well, Hillel would have said this. Well, Shammai would have said this. Well, Shammai's follower would have said this, and Hillel's so it kind of it's very specific, and it's very beautiful to know that there's like, there's so much depth. It's like, it's just again, it's really fundamentally anti-fundamentalist. So.
And all I was going to say is that, back to an argument for the sake of heaven, what they agreed upon was heaven exists, infinitely important. We're giving our love to this discussion because we want to be closer, see, understand as best we can heaven, which we both agree is the most important thing there is, no matter what. And that's a kind of perspective, certainly, that is difficult to find these days. But it's something to remember, and something that was important to Stan also, as you can see, from the many different places where he was applying certain of his ideas, such as the inverted T. And when I began to understand it myself, I realized that it was an excellent framing for perspective, for seeing things that were happening in the world as I saw it, back, and still is. Another thing I wanted to just note here, in that video clip that Bill played, Stanley talked about how he transitioned from the as above, so below to what goes up mirrors what goes under. And the thing that is important to note, or one of the many things, notice the change between noun and verb. One of his first insights and postulates, hypotheses, ways of noticing about the Hebrew letters, the alphabet, was that the standard meanings for them, Hebrew is known as what they call a rheomode language. Basically, it's a verb-based language. It's not a noun-based language. Therefore, Stan said, okay, what the letters mean, instead of going for the nouns which are in your usual dictionary these days, what's the verb that goes with that noun? Again, seeing everything in terms of what's the verb, what's the action, what's the process. That was his way of looking at text, looking at the alphabet, and looking at the reflections, the reflection interconnected, and however you want to call it, between heaven, so-called, and earth, in a way, and all of the analogies for that world, for those words, what goes up and what goes under.
Adele, you also were familiar with this idea of the schools.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that became the model for the Chevrutah, like to have a study partner. And in the sort of the model of a yeshiva, that the rabbi or teacher would ask a question about text, and off everybody goes to the midrash. What did they call it? The Beit Midrash, the library, where we're familiar with libraries that are quiet, but these libraries, people are talking and they're arguing. They're saying, well, wait, the way this is spelled and the way this is, maybe this is the imperative and maybe this is a verb and maybe it has a different meaning. And they're arguing it out. And it was in that same flavor of, this is an argument for the sake of heaven. We're here to see what are all the perspectives. Wow, you have that perspective. I didn't see that. Well, what about this? And then after all of this arguing, back into the classroom, everybody goes, and now there's a lively discussion on all of the things that were discovered. And I learned this model from my daughter, who was studying at a co-ed yeshiva, and I got to visit her in Israel and see this in action. And now I'm studying in this advanced teacher training, and we are using the Hevratah model, where we're asked questions and we meet with the same person over a period of time, answering those questions every week. And it's not, I mean, I remember there was a story that Hillel really mourned Shammai's passing because he didn't have someone to argue with in the same way. He got partners who were agreeing with him, and that didn't advance the thinking the way Shammai advanced Hillel's thinking. And to just be open to many points of view, and the way Stan introduced that film and said, here is what I've come up with, but let's argue it, right? Like, bring in the questions, bring in the arguments, because otherwise I won't know if I'm successful or not. So I see him as encouraging people to think and argue and see, are these hypotheses correct? You know, is my theory on spot, or am I off target in some way? You know, argue with me. So he invited it the way I think Hillel invited it.
He loved good questions. People who took his work seriously, and, you know, really came with their own perspectives and said, what about this? You know, or, hey, I remember this teaching. Let's look at that. People who take his work seriously, who took it, like I said, he loved good and thoughtful questions, and because they always made him think, you know, and come up with new ways of explaining something or new places to look. So yeah, that's a good thing.
In some ways he was arguing, in some ways he was arguing with himself by using the scientific method. And he talks about it at the beginning of this video. And he mentioned it again. He says, I tried everything I could to, to see what the problem was with this theory, this inverted T. But the more he looked into it, and as we'll see on this poster, you know, the more discoveries there were. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, there's an interesting saying that a Talmudic sages or people who study Talmud increase peace in the world. And one of the things you notice if you're learning the Talmud properly is that it jumps from opinion to opinion, and the opinions are always well formulated. So you jump over to this side and you go, oh, wow, that makes sense. And then you jump over to the argument and you go, oh, I think that makes sense. And you go back and forth, and then frontwards and backwards and this way and over here, and someone brings in a different topic, and then they argue about that. And then that relates tangentially to a tangent, which relates back to the original argument. So you're constantly shifting perspectives. And that training, again, if done properly, allows you to come into situations where people vastly disagree with each other and find some common ground. And more than that, it teaches you to like understand other people's perspectives and like be okay with not knowing. You know, like it's okay to not know. And I think that's also significant. Like Stan was both driven to know and incredibly curious in the infinite sense almost. And at the same time, he was humble enough to say, I don't know. and he'd sit with it until something happened, you know. And so it's an interesting, just a quick story. That I used to learn in this big yeshiva called the Mir Yeshiva with my brother-in-law once a week when we lived in Jerusalem many years ago. And what they would learn from, like, there are different set times they learned from this time. This was like the 11 to 1 set. So we would sit there, and there were it's enormous. There were probably 1,500 people in this room. And so when they're all arguing with each other, there's this roar of Torah learning. And I always wanted to sample it, you know, and it's like, because it was just, I can't explain, it was just like the most beautiful sound. And I watched these two guys, they were standing maybe 20 feet away from me or learning, and they were screaming at each other, and one is jumping up and he's pounding on the thing, and you're wrong, and here's why, and the other one says, no, you're wrong, and he stands up, and I was thought, my God, you know, if this was a bar, we'd have to call the police, you know, and it wasn't, obviously, and then the bell rang, and it's time for mincha and then lunch, and they closed the books, gave each other a hug, and they're going to go eat lunch together. You know, and it was such a perfect example of this idea, and it's worthy telling the story, because I feel like it's a lesser known idea, and I think a lot of people and a lot of pushback from the religious world is because many of the people that Stan had to deal with were not trained that way. They were trained with a perspective, and you have the dot Torah, or you have, you know, this perspective of, you know, the Torah view, as opposed to, like, you know, the broad, you know, argumentative view and shifting perspectives view. And I think that's something else. I think he challenged a lot of paradigms. And again, for a curious person, someone challenges a paradigm, it's like, okay, this is an opportunity to learn something. But I think for someone who's in it just for again, like, not l'shem shamayim, but like, not for the sake of heaven, but to, like, grab heaven. You know what I mean? As if it's like I'm going to buy a new yacht, so I'm also going to go to heaven. It's like, it's not, like, it's not the same, you know. But I feel like that physical perspective on spiritual matters, I think he ran into a lot of problems with religious people sometimes. Anyway, and not necessarily spiritual people are always turned on by what he's doing and always interested. But I think sometimes strictly religious, just, I don't know.
Yeah,
Anyway,
religious in the term, in the sense of people who were trained in the sequestered religious world. I'm aware the word religious means different things actually to different people. You know, those of us, the four of us have been around and involved in the Jewish world for a long time, where religious means, yeah, not only do you care, but you observe this and that and the other thing, and you go to yeshiva. But for somebody who is, like, totally outside of that world, religious can simply mean, oh, you know, I'm spiritual. So I just want to be clear about that. And yes, spiritually minded people, you know, caught the spark of his love of heaven and said, okay, this guy has some interesting things to say. People who worked with their hands also really grabbed onto this work, no matter what their background was, because they understood the connection of hand to mind to, you know, to soul, really. But there was a really many different groups, you know, types of backgrounds of people were attracted to this work. And one thing we discovered after a little while was that it was really important to not try to speak to too many different groups or perspectives at once, because Stanley really would have to use totally different language for these groups, which leads me back to what Daniel was saying. Something that's missing in our world is the ability to listen to another person's point of view or perspective or even language and try to make sense of it, as opposed to saying, oh, well, I don't understand this, I'm going to leave.
You know, this idea of the two schools and the argument and having one point that you're going over could have in some way been a model for the US Supreme Court, where you have 9 people sitting and arguing over a point of law, but trying to apply it to real life situations. And it should have been a model for even larger bodies like the legislatures, where you have opposing views before it got over politicized. That's the model. Of course, a lot of that goes back to the Greek democratic style also. But in terms of well, let's move on to the poster and take a look. So here's some examples of the inverted T. And again, this was Stan trying to disprove it, but coming up with so many examples. Let me see there. So if we go to this, the one on the left, the top left, the tree of Abraham. Now I should mention, if you go to our website, mehruvideo.com, there is a video called The Tree of Abraham based on a poster that Stan did that follows this idea here. It's something that I kind of did a funky animated video on it, but the dialogue is all from Stan's poster, and maybe we'll do that on a future episode. But he was looking at the Abrahamic, what's called the Abrahamic faiths, the 3 religions stemming from Abraham, and putting it into this this metaphor, the tree and the fruit. The idea being that, and he was very clear that this was what was the word he used? It wasn't an absolute, but looking at Judaism as the seed, Christianity as the tree, and Islam as the fruit, and that it was an ongoing process, as nature is, a cyclical. That was the important part of this idea, that nature is cyclical, and that all are connected. They're all connected to the same organism, but have different manifestations in real life. So I won't play that now, but I suggest going to our site and watching that video. And like I said, maybe we'll cover that in another episode. Any comments on that particular model in terms of the tree of Abraham? We can also go to the one next to it called the tribes of Israel. Judah and Ephraim. Now, Ephraim isn't something that's commonly talked about. Ephraim meaning son of Joseph, correct? Why is it not Joseph?
I think there were 2 tribes that represent Joseph, which is Ephraim and Manasseh.
Manasseh, right.
Yeah, and the 2 tribes, yeah. So
And also,
it just
go ahead,
sorry.
Dan.
No, as I say, it just represents the difference. Yehuda and then Yehuda and Benjamin, and then Judah and Benjamin, and then the other 10 tribes, which are called the lost tribes of Israel. So there were originally 12 tribes. So there's a big split between the area of Yehuda, of Judah, and then the kind of southern or southwestern area beneath that,
Right.
or around it, or whatever it is here in the north, and in the like kind of surrounding it a little bit.
Just for the historical context, there were two Israel and Judah. Israel were 10 tribes that were consumed by the Assyrians and spread, called the lost tribes, but in reality they were not lost. They made their way somewhere else. And Judah in the south, which were conquered by the Babylonians, and Judah obviously became the Jews. and ended up in Babylon, and then the Persians came, conquered the Babylonians, and brought the Jews back to Israel, and that's how things then evolved. Yeah,
You find something interesting. You find, you look at the top as the high priest, and then at the bottom is, the kind of people, the regular people. What's interesting in modern culture is, like, I feel like every religion like has like that one day that they kind of, everyone does it, what it is, or 2 days or whatever that is, whatever the religion. And a friend of mine used to joke, not really joke, he was serious. He said, it's because on that one day they become the high priest. He only went, right? The high priest only went into the Holy of Holies one day a year, right? So there's a certain truth in that there's a little bit in the people, the bottom line, there's a little bit of the high priest, and the same as the opposite is also true, like Stan said, hopefully in the high priest, there's also an understanding of the people, because he's also just a regular person,
You could see that, all of these, the horizontal elements and the vertical, if we go through the 4 of them in this particular page and compare those versus the vertical, and kind of look at the meanings. But before that, to the right of this is, again, we're going through the dimensions. And we're looking at what he calls the stick of Judah and the stick of Ephraim. And he's actually quoting it from Ezekiel 37. And he's using that metaphor of the stick to use as the lines in the inverted T. He's taking that term stick almost literally as an example of this idea.
Yeah, and also showing, if you go through, we've discussed this particular sequence before, this golden rule through the dimensions. That's the same sequence of 4 images, with the 1 circle, which looks like the inverted T, the 2 circle, in other words, it's a circle with a line out of its center, and then a sphere, again, with a line going diagrammatically, it goes up, but you can start to sense that there's bigger dimensions than this involved, to a hypersphere, a 4-dimensional figure. And it's not obvious from this particular sequence, but there are other places where he shows that this hand model is actually the equivalent of the line that goes from the center to the infinite. At any rate, and this is relating to the Ezekiel 37. I think it's 15, chapter 15. No, Ezekiel chapter 15 lines. The chapter 37 lines 15 to 26. That's it. Where they talk about it's a prophecy as to when there will be, one land, one king, one God in the land.
This is also, it's I think it's discussed here.
Yeah.
Where is it? Yeah, here it is. Yeah. Ezekiel 37:15 tells us, when the stick or tree of Judah and the stick or tree of Ephraim are unified in the hand, that's when there will be peace in the land. Judah, the tribe of Kohanim and Levites, reaches up to the transcendent and down to the world. Ephraim, the fruits, is the tribe that represents all the tribes of Israel. On the right, we see that the tree of Judah and Ephraim can grow dimensionally into the model hand that generates the letters of the alphabet and grasps the world. The equatorial plane, the earth plane of the hypersphere, represents the land. The model hand is generated by a circle and a line. These are the elements that make up pi. Jerusalem is located at 1000/pi degrees north latitude, et cetera, et cetera. This is all part of the poster, by the way, folks, so you can read this for yourself.
Yeah, and he is also referring to the fact that one of the roots of the name Ephraim is transliterated PRI, which is the Hebrew word meaning fruit. And so that's like an evocative image. You can kind of think about it in a poetic term. What is a fruit? You know, fruits are what we have here. If we have the fruit of an idea, you have an idea and you make something with your hands, and the fruits of your idea, assuming that they're physical, you know, are something here on the earth plane that you see.
It's amazing how it all connects. I mean, there's so many different elements that are just connected. If people saw this, and Stan was so frustrated, why don't they see this? You know, why don't people know this? And it was just a common source of frustration.
He didn't realize that his mind worked a lot faster than most people's.
Well, that's true. And it was all encompassing because there's all these different elements that are connected.
I mean, part of this is so powerful because, I mean, this is like exactly what we need. You know, it's like we all need each other. I mean, that's the bottom line. You know what I mean? Like different perspectives, we need each other. You know, I mean, this is pointing to a particular problem that's always existed, which is between Joseph and Yehuda and Judah. Goes all the way back to the first part of Genesis. We need each other. You know, like if everyone was totally enveloped in spirituality all the time, like who would be a garbage collector? You know what I mean? Like, you know, and if everyone was only garbage collectors, then what are we living for? We're living to be a garbage collector? Like, you know what I mean? Like the two sides need each other. They're intertwined. And that's so much a part of Stan's message. And everything he did was that Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Elokim Echad. It's one, there's one thing here. It's oneness going on. We can look at it from multiple perspectives, but we can't deny, not only can't deny the oneness, we have to affirm the oneness. And I think that Stan's work is like this incredible, like a way of just constantly affirming the oneness, but kind of showing its inner details.
That's right. It's the mechanics of oneness. You're right. But there's also one other thing, you know, we need each other, but look at ourselves as individuals. This Model T models us, every human. And he talked about it early in the research in terms of inside and outside. That, you know, he said that, I think it was Rabbi Akiva who said that when the inside and outside are identical, that is integrity. And he talked about that early on. So we are the model, the inverted T. Our inside is the vertical, and our outside in the three-dimensional world is the horizontal. So it's not just you know, some outside universal. It's we individuals, and as collective society. Here we have the priestly blessing. And it's defined by two hands. And he's putting the inverted T and the triangle. Now, some of Star Trek fans will recognize the hand that Leonard Nimoy used, incorporated into the program. What is the priestly blessing? I mean, we know what it is, but maybe we could explain. You have a reference?
Yeah, it's basically, the synopsis, I don't remember is exactly right, live long and prosper. I mean, it's much more detailed than that, but I mean, the basic thing is like absolute, like a goodness and love and like prosperity and wonderful things for you. Like, it's just like coming from God. Like, just, that's it, you know, you should be blessed and protected, you know, God should shine his face upon you and be gracious towards you. His face should be above you, on top of you, kind of floating on you. I'm not sure how to say it. And he should make your life peaceful. Like, it's just everything good. Like, the essence of it is like only good things for you.
It's a
and for
beautiful-
everyone, and not just you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, and that's
Yeah.
like you're supposed to actually with people who are either from Iraq or Persia or Iran, and like the Edot Mizrach, the Eastern communities, they do that every day, no matter where you are.
Yeah.
Period. And in the Ashkenazi tradition, it's every Shabbos if you live, I think, in Eretz Yisrael. And I forgot the details, but in Eretz Yisrael, it's either every day or I think it's also every day with the Ashkenazim, or maybe it's just on Shabbos. They're different traditions, but it's incorporated, especially in Israel. It's incorporated every day. You hear the priestly blessing now. In outside of Israel, the Ashkenazim do this on holidays, on the 3 times a year. We hear this blessing, but what's that?
No, it's a solemn rite on Yom Kippur, when you're not allowed to look, and they have to have a kohanim do the reciting, and the Levite washes the hand. I mean, it's practice.
It's a whole thing.
Thousands
Yeah,
of years.
yeah. And the Shefatal relates the 14 bones of the fingers on each hand, which are 28 bones, to the 28 letters of Bereshit. So he directly, and the first thing he does is to relate the hands, the structure of the hands, to the first pasuk. Period. That's in his entire thing in the introduction. So it's like it's like right there from 500 years ago, And if he had it, he was definitely going on an older tradition. So like the connection between the hands in Bereshit and the first verse of Genesis is like rock solid, like according to the Kabbalists. So Stan is, again, like he just kind of brought this Kabbalistic tradition into the modern world,
Without realizing at first that that's what he was doing.
Yeah, and just so anyone who comes upon this, he'd never seen the Shefatal, so he never saw it. You know what I mean? So like it still blows my mind. You've got 500 years ago, this rabbi Kabbalist kind of whatever super Jewish person. I don't know how to say it. Like he was amazing. And then you have Stan, also a super Jewish person, a super spiritual person. And 500 years later, and he comes to the same exact thing, but from a different perspective. Mind blowing.
It is mind blowing, but that's what he did. He just kept at it and kept, just digging and finding and, finding these references that just fit into this model. To the left of that, we see the tree in the garden, the tree in the garden, the Garden of Eden reference. And then to the left of that, over here, we see the golden rule and the golden ratio, as above, so below.
And the math that you see there is related to the inverted T triangle, which we have discussed before, and you will see it's not captioned in the same way, but if you notice the green lines, move the poster up just a little bit. Yeah, there. Okay, on the right-hand side of this blue row, the 2 triangles that are outlined in green, that's what he's referring to when he goes to the golden rule, golden ratio, 1 plus the square root of 2 over 2. And there are other posters where he actually goes into that in much greater detail.
He found it in the Pope's hat, believe it or not. There it is. Masonic compass.
Yeah, if you notice again, Masonic compass, what he's looking at, the vertical line of the inverted T is not, he didn't include that in that particular drawing, but the angles of the triangle are the same as, if you go all the way to the right, are the same as the triangle, which is formed by the inverted T. So that's why that one is there.
Discrete and continuous. this has to do with the cubic stone ziggurat tetrachus. This has to do somewhat with a pyramid, I believe.
Okay, the deal behind this one is there is a very common image of called the tetractys, which in general is represented as 10 dots or 10 spheres arranged in a triangular formation. And if you do it with spheres, it forms an equilateral triangle. And particularly when we were first presenting this aspect of our work to the world, people got it confused. People would say, oh, tetractys 10 equilateral, why isn't it an equilateral triangle? Well, it's just not. It's a triangle where the base and the height are the same length. But what he discovered, actually, he discovered this one physically. He always had, and I still have, whole sets of little acrylic geometric forms. And he had a bunch of little geometric cubes. And so he was playing around with those, and he discovered that when he stacked 10 cubes together and then connected them, as you see in that triangle that's above the words the one and the many, that the angles of that triangle actually formed the inverted T triangle. So that, in a sense, brings in a reference to the ziggurats, which were pyramids formed with, with cubic steps on them. His mind ranged to looking for congruences in all different kinds of spaces, not all of which we explored, but there is for those of you who are familiar with Kabbalistic works, he used this particular image of the triangle with the cubes inside, relating it to a section of the Sefer Yetzirah, which starts 10 and not 11, 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11, and did a whole thing with that. But that was an insight that he got after realizing that if you make the 10 dots as cubes and not spheres, then the 10 actually made this inverted T triangle.
Okay, well, we're going to continue this on our next episode because there's much more. I highly suggest you check out this poster, check out the video, and we'll be talking about this again next time. So for now, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.